leave it all behind you. I said, take down everything that stands in your way. Don't stop believing it'll work out again, my friend. Stand out and be a part of everything good. Wake up, you're gonna be all that you should. Try out all the things you always wanted to be. You'll see, 'cause I know what I know, that you've got it in you, and I see that you are a winner.
Okay, I kind of made a promise that I would read the second, another bit from Dan Barker's book called Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. This is his chapter called Did Jesus Exist? Last night, or yesterday, I read the portion where he talks about Flavius Josephus. Further into the chapter, he's talking about the 2nd century and later, because Josephus is the closest, the most of all the historians who were born after this character's supposed life and death. Josephus is the one who came right after, supposedly. Okay, except it's forgery, so who cares? These guys, after Josephus, they're basically later on into the 2nd century. The 2nd century later, as he says. And again, like if I wrote a book report about Abraham Lincoln and there was nothing else in existence to document that Abraham Lincoln existed except my book report that I wrote, a couple centuries after his supposed life and death, would my book report be sufficient evidence to show that this person existed? How does my book report make him any more real than a fictional character if the only evidence for his existence is my book report? Which is basically the same thing as these 2nd century historians, assuming they wrote anything at all and assuming that what they wrote about had anything to do with Jesus of Nazareth and not some other person named Jesus or whatever. So anyway, that's just my little intro into this into this part that I'm going to read by Dan Barker. The 2nd century and later. After Josephus, there are other writers who mention Christianity, but even if we are confident that their writings are authentic, they are too late to claim the confirming impact of a 1st century witness. Suetonius wrote a biography called 12 Caesars around the year 112 CE, mentioning that Claudius banished the Jews from Rome since they had made a commotion because of Christus, and that during the time of Nero, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. Notice that there is no mention of Jesus by name. It is unlikely that Christianity had spread as far as Rome during the reign of Claudius, or that it was large enough to have caused a revolt. Christus does not mean Christ. It was a common name meaning good, used by both slaves and free people and occurring more than 80 times in Latin inscriptions. Even if Suetonius made a typo and truly meant Christus, parentheses Christ, he may have been referring only to the Jews in Rome who were expecting a Messiah, not to Jesus of Nazareth. It could have been someone else, maybe a Roman Jew, who stepped forward. It is only eager believers who jump to the conclusion that this provides evidence for Jesus. Nowhere in any of Suetonius's writings did he mention Jesus of Nazareth. Even if he had, his history would not necessarily have been reliable. He also reported, for example, that Caesar Augustus bodily rose to heaven when he died, an event that few modern scholars consider historical. In 112 CE, Pliny the Younger said that Christians were singing a hymn to Christ as to a god. That's it. In all of Pliny's writings, we find one small tangential, T-A-N-G-E-N-T-I-A-L reference, and not even to Christ, but to Christians. Again, notice the absence of the name Jesus. This could have referred to any of the other Christs, for some reason I can't pronounce words today, who were being followed by Jews who thought they had found a Messiah. Pliny's report hardly counts as history, since he's only relaying what other people believed. Even if this sentence referred to a group of followers of Jesus, no one denies that Christianity was in existence at that time. Pliny, at the very most, might be useful in documenting the religion, but not the historic Jesus. Sometime after 117 CE, the Roman historian Tacitus, probably said it wrong, wrote in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, Nero looked around for a scapegoat and inflicted the most fiendish tortures on a group of persons already hated for their crimes. This was the sect known as Christians. Their founder, one Christus, had been put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. This checked the abominable superstition for a while, but it broke out again and spread, not merely through Judea, where it originated, but even to Rome itself, the great reservoir and collecting ground for every kind of depravity and filth. Those who confessed to being Christians were at once arrested, but on their testimony a great crowd of people were convicted, not so much on the charge of arson, but of hatred of the entire human race. In this passage, Tacitus depicts early Christians as hated for their crimes and associated with depravity and filth. This is not a very flattering picture. But even if it is valid, it tells us nothing about Jesus of Nazareth. Tacitus claims no first-hand knowledge of Christianity. He is merely repeating the then common ideas about Christians. A modern parallel would be a 20th century historian reporting that Mormons believe that Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni, which would hardly make it a historical proof, even though it is as close as a century away. There is no other historical confirmation that Nero persecuted Christians. Nero did persecute Jews, and perhaps Tacitus was confused about this. There certainly was not a great crowd of Christians in Rome around 60 CE, and the term Christian was not in use in the first century. Tacitus is either doctoring history from a distance or repeating a myth without checking his facts. Historians generally agree that Nero did not burn Rome, so Tacitus is in error to suggest that he would have needed a scapegoat in the first place. No one in the 2nd century ever quoted this passage of Tacitus, and in fact it appears almost word for word in the writings of someone else, Sulpicius Severus, in the 4th century, where it is mixed in with other myths. The passage is therefore highly suspect and adds virtually no evidence for a historic Jesus. In the 9th century, a Byzantine writer named George Syncellus, I think, Syncellus, quoted a 3rd century Christian historian named Julius Africanus, who quoted an unknown writer named Thallus on the darkness at the crucifixion. Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun, but in my opinion he is wrong. All of the works of Africanus are lost, so there is no way to confirm the quote or examine its context. We have no idea who Thallus was, or Thales, or when he wrote. Eusebius, 4th century, mentions a history of Thales in 3 books ending about 112 CE. So the suggestion is that Thales might have been a near contemporary of Jesus. Actually, he has in parentheses, actually the manuscript is damaged, and Thales is merely a guess from space Allos, Samaritanos. That word allos actually means other in Greek, so it may have been simply saying the other Samaritan. There is no historical evidence of an eclipse during the time Jesus was supposedly crucified. The reason Africanus doubted the eclipse is because Easter happened near the full moon and a solar eclipse would have been impossible at that time. Even ancient skeptics knew that the full moon occurs when it is on the opposite side of the earth from the sun, where it is unable to move between the sun and the earth to produce an eclipse. There is a fragment of a personal letter from a Syrian named Mara bar Serapion to his son in prison of uncertain date, probably 2nd or 3rd century, that mentions that the Jews of that time had killed their wise king. However, the New Testament reports that the Romans, not the Jews, killed Jesus. The Jews had killed other leaders, for example, the Essene teacher of righteousness. If this truly is a report of a historical event rather than the passing on of folklore, it could have been a reference to someone else. It is worthless as evidence for Jesus of Nazareth, yet it can be found on the lists of some Christian scholars as proof that Jesus existed. A 2nd century satirist named Lucian wrote that the basis for the Christian sect was a man who was crucified in Palestine. But this is equally worthless as historical evidence. He is merely repeating what Christians believed in the 2nd century. Lucian does not mention Jesus by name. This reference is too late to be considered historical evidence, and since Lucian did not consider himself a historian, neither should we. All these confirmations of Jesus are at best second-hand hearsay of what others thought to have believed. They would be worthless in a court of law. It would be like a witness to a murder saying, "I did not see the act itself, but I read in a letter from someone who is now dead that they heard from a probably reliable source that someone actually believed that a person with the same or a similar name committed the crime." Bottom of the barrel. In addition to Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, and the others, there are a handful of highly questionable so-called evidences that some Christians have put forward. These include Tertullian, Tertullian, 197 CE. Phlegon, Phlegon, unknown date. Justin Martyr, about 150 CE, and portions of the Jewish Talmud, 2nd through 5th centuries, that mention Jesus in an attempt to discredit Christianity, supposedly showing that even the enemies of Jesus did not doubt his existence. Though all of these late opinions are flimsy, some Christians make a showy point of listing them with little elaboration in their books of apologetics. Ministers can rattle off these historical confirmations with little fear that their congregations will take the time to investigate their authenticity. I include one other very silly attempt here. The Archko volume, ARCHKO volume. Not because it has ever come up in any of my debates or has been used by serious Christian apologists, but because it shows the lengths to which some believers will go to prove Christianity and how eagerly some gullible believers swallow such nonsense. And these are modern believers, supposedly more informed and sophisticated than the ancient writers. A Christian actually mailed me a copy of the Archco volume. This eyewitness testimony supposedly reports authentic first-hand accounts of Jesus from the early 1st century. It includes letters from Pilate to Rome, glowing interviews of the shepherds outside Bethlehem who visited the baby Jesus at the manger after being awakened by angels, and so on. Its flowery King James prose makes entertaining reading, but it is not considered authentic by any scholar. It was written in the 19th century by a traveling salesman who said he translated it from original documents found in the basement of the Vatican. The translations were mailed overseas in installments after payment for each one was received. No one has ever seen the original documents. In Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Josh McDowell makes an argument that is common among apologists. There are now more than 5,300 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Add over 10,000 Latin Vulgate and at least 9,300 other early versions, MSS, parentheses, and we have more than 24,000 manuscript copies of portions of the New Testament in existence today. No other document of antiquity even begins to approach such numbers and attestation. In comparison, and it's spelled Iliad, Iliad, by Homer, is second with only 643 manuscripts that still survive. Do you see how he is piling on numbers? What do the 10,000 Latin Vulgate copies have to do with original Greek manuscripts? This information might cause believers to applaud with smugness, but it misses the point. What does the number of copies have to do with authenticity? If 1 million copies of this book are printed, does it make it any more truthful? Are the historical facts reported in the Iliad considered reliable? There are currently hundreds of millions of copies of the Quran in existence, in many forms and scores of translations. Does the sheer number of copies make it more reliable than, say, a single inscription on an Egyptian sarcophagus? This argument is a smokescreen. There are no original manuscripts, autographs he has in parentheses, of the Bible in existence, so we all agree that we are working from copies of copies. Critics might agree that some current translations of the New Testament are based on a reasonably accurate transcription of variations from early forms of some of the Greek documents, but what does this have to do with authenticity, reliability, or truthfulness? And why are there variations at all? Yes, scribes sometimes make minor copying errors, but few believers realize how many discrepancies there are among the manuscripts. Bart Ehrman, in Misquoting Jesus, reminds us that there are more variants among the ancient documents than there are words in the New Testament. I want to repeat that. Bart Ehrman, in Misquoting Jesus, reminds us that there are more variants among the ancient documents than there are words in the New Testament. Another argument made by Josh McDowell and others is the close interval of time between the events or original writing and the earliest copies in our possession. Homer wrote the Iliad in 900 BCE, but our earliest copy is from 400 BCE, a span of 500 years. Aristotle wrote in 384 through 322 BCE, and the earliest copy of his work dates from 1100 CE, a gap of 1400 years. In contrast, the New Testament was written, McDowell says, between 40 and 100 CE, and the earliest copy dates from 125 CE, a time span of 25 years. Actually, the earliest copy does not date from 125 CE. It is the earliest fragment, a few verses from the Gospel of John, that dates from then. There is no way to verify from those few verses whether the rest of John or any of the remainder of the New Testament is reliable. Most of the copies of the manuscripts that we have on hand date from a millennium later, so McDowell's implication is misleading. All of this is important when considering the reliability of the text itself. A shorter interval of time allows for fewer corruptions and variants. So why are there so many variants if the time was so short? But even if the time interval were extremely brief, it has no relevance to the reliability of the content. If the New Testament should be considered reliable on this basis, then so should the Book of Mormon, which was supposedly written or copied by Joseph Smith in 1823 and first published in 1830, a gap of only 7 years. In addition to Joseph Smith, there are signed testimonies of 11 witnesses who claim to have seen the gold tablets on which the angel Moroni wrote the Book of Mormon. We are much closer in history to the origin of Mormonism than to the origin of Christianity. There are millions of copies of the Book of Mormon in a thriving Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with millions of members and billions of dollars in assets to prove its veracity. Though most scholars, pro and con, agree that the current edition of the Book of Mormon is a trustworthy copy of the 1830 version, few Christian scholars consider it to be reliable history.